the rich have got richer and the poor have been getting poorer. And the middle class is increasingly strained and strained and strained until we realize at one point that we are slaves, that we are working in a system that no longer serves us, and that the economy is no longer a construct to help make our society work well and engage trade and enable trade and engage people in collaborative work, but that it is starting to be the master.
Joined today by Professor Phoebe Barnard. Phoebe, thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
What a thrill. Thank you so much, Jesse. It's always fun to talk with you.
Indeed. Let's start at the start. Could you share a little bit about your background and your personal and research interests?
So I'm one of those creatures who started out in a relatively privileged, educationally privileged environment, not so much financially, but with a loving family that made sure that I had plenty of exposure to nature and that I could study further if I wanted to. Big thrill. So I got sucked into a very naturalistic, natural sciences left brain background for quite a long time. And it's taken me a few decades to really draw in the power and the glory of one's right brain and heart-centeredness too. So I am a biodiversity and climate vulnerability and adaptation specialist, although I started as an evolutionary behavioral ecologist. I grew up in North America, studied in Canada, went off to Africa to do a job in Zimbabwe. 3 years turned into 34 years. And coming back to the US after 38 years away, I am now really stuck into the big issues of what do we need to make civilization shift at this massive and alarming crossroads of human history, and what's it going to take to get where we need to be from where we are now.
Let's zoom in on, 34 years, how are we possibly going to sort of talk about all the things you learned? But you reference in a few of different papers I've read of yours and interviews you've done, you've referenced some experiences that you had in Namibia and in South Africa that have informed your thinking now that you're back working in the West. I'd love if we could get into a few of those, whichever ones come to mind. I know, again, 34 years is a lot to pull from, but ones that rise up for you that feel illuminating for some of the crises we face.
I was so lucky to have those opportunities. I will forever be grateful for them. I was able to work in governments in two countries that were at their crossroads of their own histories. Namibia in its independence from colonial rule in South Africa, by South Africa, Britain, and Germany, and South Africa in its crossroads of post-apartheid democratic transition. And those were incredibly valuable opportunities. But in hindsight, I realized what an important moment that was, and how the very acknowledgement of a historical crossroads by a group of people in a country could open up conversations about how to make the future work. And I think that all of us in civilization face this moment now in terms of whether we have a future, how we get there, what kind of decisions we may wish to take, personally, nationally, community-wise, spiritually, all of that. And so I think that those privileges of being able to work setting up and running programs for the government of Namibia at its independence, being able to set up and run national and bioregional projects in South Africa that would really help give power to those countries' constitutions, which are a lot more progressive than the US's constitution, for example, enabled us to be able to open up our minds and ask those questions. What kind of a society do we want, and how are we going to get there from here? Also, to just have the diverse experiences that enabled me to interrogate my own blind spots, my own assumptions, my own cultural teachings that I brought with me into discussions, and to learn to be a better listener, a deep learner and listener.
That's amazing. Thinking about how folks in the West who are well-intentioned, but approaching these problems with some of maybe the um, post-colonial or colonial blinders that they bring to these conversations. How do you approach moments, instances like that? I imagine you run into that more often than not.
I do, and I suppose I try to sit on my hands a little bit and not leap up and say, but in Namibia, we were doing things like that 25 years ago. Come on, get real. I don't want to say that. I recognize that we're all on our own journey, and it's taken us all different times to reach our own personal epiphanies. And that it's okay for people to be where they are as long as they don't clamp down and grab onto the ground and say, this is me, and, to hell with you. So I try to talk with people about the experience of just, I guess, encountering my own blind spots and starting to think about the way we walk through this world a little bit more. The attitudes of perhaps a little bit of human supremacy or entitlement that we bring with us. And once you start to tell your own story of learning, it helps people open up more. If you confront them, you criticize them, then they retreat and they become more, just more. Verkrampte is the first word that I can think of. That's a South African word for being, just very closed down. I try. I don't often succeed fully with being completely mindful about helping other people on their journey, because we're all on our own journey. I'm certainly still on mine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you sharing. You've written a lot about overshoot and the human behavioral crisis, both of which are framed in different instances as kind of the fundamental issue. You've participated in framing the human behavioral crisis as the underlying driver of overshoot, which is maybe the combined symptomatic expression of the human behavioral crisis. Could you share about what those two things are and their interrelationship?
Yeah, interesting question. Thanks, Jesse. On the line of our learning journey, only 5 years ago, I understood our root causes of our meta crisis, our polycrises, as as a matter of just our numbers and our appetites, our population, our hyperconsumption. And it took me a while, and it took the urgent, kind of knocking on my door and kicking up my backside by Joseph Mertz, the lead author on that paper, to help me understand that I'd been sitting on the real root cause my whole career. I started out in evolutionary behavioral ecology, and I was not adequately factoring in our own behavioral predispositions, the selective pressures that have acted on us for hundreds of thousands of years as hominids, and all of that. So when I was running a global coalition called the Stable Planet Alliance for a few years, I started to factor in our mindsets, our behavioral attitudes and assumptions and preconceptions into that mix. So I don't wish to imply that there's one great truth in life, but I do think that we can make a lot of progress as humanity if we can start to think through more carefully what it is that we have inherited from our past and which of those things we wish consciously to take with us into the future, and which things we'd rather just let go and leave behind. And if we can't completely let them go, because our brains are wired based on this evolutionary past, then how we can become more conscious of these things. And, essentially, this is what the last 100 years or so almost has been about with the League of Nations and the United Nations, and trying to really help society come together as a more mindful and more collaborative, multilateral space of people. And we struggle with that, don't we? I mean, here we are in the bleakest geopolitical year that I can remember. Wars and reactivity, and I don't want to call it testosterone poisoning, but shall we say the tendency of certain leaders to um, denigrate each other to make themselves feel better, and to invade other countries rather than negotiate. All of those things remind us that we will always struggle against this evolutionary past. But if we're not talking about it, we never become aware of what is our problem. And people say, what the hell is our problem? Well, this is one really fundamental one.
So I think a lot of people are still grappling, if they've even encountered the word overshoot, they're grappling with the fact that climate change is not the main problem. And then something like overshoot is proposed, which when you really face up to what overshoot is, you see that really the only clear option there is that we need to use less somehow.
Mhm.
And that comes with a range of different prescriptions, a range of different responses that might hold promise in the future, but we're still exploring. In a recent paper that you were an author on, you identify 6 priorities that kind of sketch out the the real problem of overshoot, and you identify 3 among that number that individuals can start to participate in change with, and then you do so across 3 timescales. So this is my crack open, like, let's talk about that.
Whew, yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, the paper was called World Scientists' Warnings into Action, Local to Global. And the 6 issues, I had to just jot them down while you were talking so that I wouldn't completely. Energy, pollutants, nature, food systems, population, and the economy. And actually, there was a seventh one. The first 6 that I just mentioned were coming out of the World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency paper, which I'd also been on a few years earlier. But I was getting very impatient, just issuing warnings, more warnings. So when we took this scientist warnings into action paper, the more I thought about it, the more I needed to add a 7th issue, and that was governance and everything that goes with good governance or bad governance, corruption, mismanagement, autocracy, all of these things. I think it's important to understand, as you hinted just now, that climate change and all of these other issues are mere symptoms of our tendency to just bulldoze through our lives and our civilizational past, and periodically just overextend ourselves, overuse resources, and so on. Each of these issues, energy, pollutants, and so on, is just one of these symptoms, but we've been treating them as though they're operating in isolation. And that tends to have a very paralyzing effect on most people. They get overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, I've got to deal with this and I've got to think about that. And, it's just too much. I'm going to switch off and watch Netflix. And so the important message, I think, here is that by focusing on the things that drive overshoot, our numbers, our appetites, our mindsets, if we can look at ourselves more differently, more mindfully, and look at how we tend to approach the world, it boils down to just developing an awareness of the way we tend to be with our mindsets and our attitudes, and to focus more on developing different relationships with nature, relationships with each other. We've just come through these 2 centuries or more of colonizing, dominating, extractive, predatory, power asymmetric history of especially Western civilization, but not uniquely Western civilization. And we should be aware that now is the time to stop and think about where that's got us to, and what we may need to be conscious of and shift, and those things to take forward and those things to let go. So that paper was an attempt really just to throw those into relief. And then I was hoping that we would be able to move forward with taking those issues and scaling them down into what you can do if you are a city councillor, for example, and you want to move forward on these things and you don't quite know how, that it would lead to a series of actions and collaborations that would enable people to start moving on. I was not able to do that on top of everything else that I'm doing. But when Joseph Mertz and I started talking about the behavioral crisis, we did want to move ahead in terms of looking at how our behaviors underlie our, excessive demand for energy, rather than thinking, how can I get by just more simply? How can I live in this building without having everything just powering on and wasting energy or wasting water and so on? I guess I'd like to say simply that it all starts with starting the conversation. Our purpose in these papers is really just to start the conversation and get people thinking about fast fashion. What does that, what are our attitudes contributing to our tendency for impulse buying and for trying things on and then sending them back, even knowing that those things will probably go to the landfill. And interestingly, as you I think know, probably one of the biggest media uptakes of that paper on the behavioral crisis was from the fashion industry. Vogue Business has done 3 articles, I think now, maybe 4, on that subject, drawing from our paper. So it's had a surprising and, to me, quite surprising and enlightening response to what
Mm,
is essentially an academic paper.
mm. So that brings up 2 questions for me. I'm curious to know what the response has been, like, thinking of the readers of the Vogue Business articles. What were their responses? And then also thinking about the not politically conservative, but the intellectually and academically conservative culture of scientists. How did they respond? I know that you had, I believe it was 3,000 signatories on that
On
first
the Warnings
roll.
into Action paper, yeah, we had
Mhm.
something over 3,000. I've stopped keeping track of it, but
Yeah,
from
yeah.
about 160 countries, so I was pretty happy with that. But it's not enough to change the world. We need to move on to take better steps now. So I'm hoping that with this focus on societal limits and what the very interesting stuff going on at the Mertz Institute is doing, then I think we can help change the industries that are barreling along, making profit, sucking up people's attention, their eyeballs, and social media, and fashion, and this and that. That we can start conversations about: is this serving us? Are we feeling satisfied, or are we feeling empty? What do we wish to do, individually or as a community or as a society?
Mm.
I don't think I
One
answered
thing
your question, though, did I?
Oh, yeah, I mean, kind of. Great answer all the same. I was curious, yeah, like if folks in the fashion industry kind of met that in a way that seemed like they were receptive and like looking toward change. I know that there's a danger sometimes when you're talking about like massive scale industries where it's like, the revolution will be televised type of thing, where um, folks hear the criticism, believe the criticism, parrot the criticism, but make no actual meaningful change. It's almost like by levying the criticism, they can then self-absolve.
Mm,
They can say like, I'm aware of the problem. I'm speaking to the problem. It's not my problem to solve.
mm,
And so, yeah, I didn't know if any folks had reported back,
mm.
what their response to the articles were or anything like that.
Yeah, I think Joseph Mertz is better placed than I to speak to that. I don't really know the extent to which there's been actual behavior change, but I do think that our combined strategy is really to speak to the influential, corridors of power, the wheels of behavior change, and just plant seeds that are reaching increasingly fertile soil. A lot of
Mm,
people feel that there's something wrong about we the way we consume generally, but also specifically the way things magically appear on our doorstep for us to try on and have a little girly moment or whatever. And of course, it's not just women, and then send things back. There's there's people that may never change on that line, but I think there's enough people for whom there's a little bit of discomfort about that it will change things overall. What I think we do need to do more intentionally is increase the pressure of alternative narratives, because we've been so dominated by this buy, 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 drill, drill, drill kind of narration. And until we have alternative narratives that help us think, is this really what I want? Or am I just, caught on this steam train that's barreling along into the future? Then we're not going to change. It's become the water that we swim in. And sometimes you need to be pulled out of that water for a minute to think, oh, I can breathe again.
mm. It reminds me of the David Foster Wallace thing of "This is water," um, or like the fish in the water doesn't even realize that it's swimming in water, and we have a similar relationship to so many of the systems that we are within, but also that we perpetuate.
Yeah, that's our culture,
Um,
and we don't question it for a long time. Sometimes we are in our 40s, 50s, 60s before we question it, but for a lot of people, they start to question it as teenagers. That's the whole great thing about teenage years. You question stuff, and now is the time for us to be seriously questioning almost everything that we about the
mm.
water that we're swimming in.
You identify the role of media in creating change, and you also identify um, this history of propaganda with Eddie Bernays and public relations, and I was a little surprised. That's more the sort of um, intellectual space that I come from, so I was surprised to see that in a scientific essay, and I was excited. Talk about why media and storytelling play such a critical role with the human behavioral crisis.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Um, it's a provocative paper intentionally, but we we have been, our brains are hardwired for storytelling. That is our evolutionary cultural history of being in small clans around the fire with oral traditions and fables. And media has seized on that to take over uh, and create a machine that empties our pockets and fills the pockets of other people. It's worked phenomenally successfully. And that's why I think it was quite interesting and provocative to have four, essentially global marketing executives or strategists as co-authors on the paper, all disaffected strategists and executives who understood the damage that the industry has been doing, but know that it doesn't have to be this way, that we can change it. And I believe that we have no choice now, but to at least ask, isn't this a tool that we need to use? We have this global marketing machine, and it's being fed with certain values. What if we were to change those values and just remind people that profit is not the only goal in life? And perhaps it's leading us to the edge of an abyss that will create great misery, if not kill us all, and not just humanity, of course, but tens of millions of other species that are evolved on this exquisite planet. So I think just starting the conversation about whether we should use marketing psychology for good rather than for profit, that's a worthy conversation to hold. But whether or not people get into that particular conversation, I think, this was a difficult thing for me because I'm one of those people that sort of stays away from all that stuff. I buy maybe one or two pieces of, socks or t-shirts a year. I'm not a huge consumer and I stay away from all of that glitzy stuff. You can't even get me to walk through a duty-free place in an airport without holding my breath because it's so overwhelming with perfume and noise and lights and all of that. So I'm not your natural strategist on this line, but I did ask myself, we've been doing all of these good, well-meaning things with education, with values training, with faith traditions, all of these things for the last 50 or 70 years since we've realized that we're really heading for trouble. Is it getting us far enough? Is it working? Is it getting us where we need to go fast enough? And I think it isn't. It's not to say that those things don't matter, that they aren't important, they are, but it's too slow. So
Mm,
what if we can shift this global marketing guzzling machine for good instead of for evil?
mm. Yeah, another thing that you bring up, I believe, in that same paper is just how anomalous the past 200 years are in the course of human history in terms of our growth. And extending that, so many of the systems that we inhabit are so novel, and yet we take them, it is the water we swim in. Neoliberalism is, 70 years old, something like that. Modern public relations and advertising as we understand it is, we could even chart it back 100 years, but it really didn't take shape until mid-century. So like all of this is only a few generations old, and depending on where you set the marker back, we're at least 100,000 years old as a species, if not much more, depending on where the evolutionary sort of fork falls for you. And so these are vanishingly small timescales that we are treating like it's the only way to do things. And so that fills me with sort of both hope and dread. Like I'm inspired by the fact that systems can change that rapidly, but I'm also quite daunted that they were able to concretize so thoroughly in such a short period of time. Do you feel anything similar to that? Like, how do you feel when you kind of confront those ideas?
I'm very interested in how quickly we can change when we have to. We know that in certain circumstances where there's technological or medical imperatives, getting to the moon, solving, developing a COVID vaccine, that we can do things very quickly. When it comes to people's comforts and preferences and cultural values, it's not so easy, but we can do it if we have to. If if we know that the alternative is, at the very least, considerable misery for hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people, including many of us, um, and is that not enough to drive us? Well, so far, not really. Apparently, my mother was born in 1924. I was the last born child in 1961. And my mother was an absolutely wonderful, heart centered woman, but she did completely buy into this myth of post World War II progress. And we've got to remember that World War II and World War I before it, and the Great Depression in between, were such horrendous times that we can't criticize people for wanting to breathe out and have some comfort and have a nice, peaceful life, move to the suburbs, all of that. My mother loved that time. She was the perfect 1950s, 60s, 70s housewife. And she brought all of that notion of progress and greatness into the family narrative. The number of times I was told, this is the greatest society on earth. And for that generation, it really was. It, with the Nazis and everything, they had good reason to be proud. But it took us along a road, and it took time for most people to start to question it. Me, I started to question it pretty early on, perhaps partly because I had some quite smart siblings and a quiet father who very slowly changed the narrative for me. But just, I guess, I realized that things were not going well. This wasn't the way I wished to be. That I found it. I found the comfort and um, the comfort and the excess oppressive. So I had one of those epiphanies relatively early on, but most people take a long time to question the values of the society in which they're born and brought up. It often works for people, but of course, it really doesn't work for many people. And in the last decades, I think even white privileged people have started to acknowledge that it really isn't working for most people. It may not be even working for them. So behavior change is a slow and it can be an episodic process. It may be gradual change, it may be something that suddenly confronts people and gives them that epiphany of, holy shit, what are we going to do about all of this?
Mm. You brought up obviously the fact that privileged white folks are starting to experience this maybe more palpably than they did before, or just not experiencing it per se, but waking up to the realities. You've written about the social and cultural dimensions of these crises, which often get elided in these conversations where it's like we, capital W, we need to ramp down fossil fuels. We need to use less. Could you talk about how it's not quite so simple? It's not quite there's not a monolithic we, and that we're dealing with a sort of multifaceted problem that involves different interventions across different levels of the population and sort of cultures and constructions.
We live in the most incredibly, obscenely unequal world. And it took me a while to realize that too. Although as a teenager, I became an anti-apartheid activist, which changed my course in life. But um, I think America, the myth of prosperity and progress and unity and melting pot, all of those good ideas proved to be hollow over the last little while because inequality and power and wealth asymmetries have just started to corrode the fabric of the society that we inhabit. If we cannot deal with inequity at the root of our solutions going forward. It will only be magnified a thousandfold as society gets increasingly strained by population or poor service delivery or its own inequality. And so we need to talk about it and resolve it. And of course, the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd episodes were only the most recent in the United States, and the yellow jersey, yellow vest protests in France and other countries. We have been many people have been profiting handsomely from the last 50 years, and yet people have, the rich have got richer and the poor have been getting poorer, and the middle class is increasingly strained and strained and strained until we realize at one point that we are slaves, that we are working in a system that no longer serves us, that the economy is no longer a construct to help make our society work well and engage trade and enable trade and engage people in collaborative work, but that it is starting to be the master and not the product. So I guess we have an opportunity here to decide, are we going to have a revolution in those, of the political economy, or are we going to be able to tweak capitalism and neoliberalism to move onto a better plane? Anyone who's watched the Arab Spring, I think, wants to think about ways that we can avoid a completely debilitating post-revolutionary set of misery in countries. But nonetheless, most people that have not gone through a war or a post-revolutionary set of miserable decades doesn't really know how bad it can be. So a lot of people, even some of my acquaintances and friends, still talk about it as though, we need revolution now. In principle, I agree with that. But revolution in practice is a very different thing, and we need to be super careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Such it would be.
Yeah, recently, my partner and I were having a conversation with our friend who was born in Afghanistan, lives in America now, and was looking at some of the ways that leftists were speaking about voting for Democrats, and I understand many of the complaints there, but responding from the perspective of somebody who's watched what collapse looks like, especially when collapse happens quickly. And he was like, people seem to think that things collapse and then you just build them right back up. But a lot of the time things just collapse and they stay broken. And so I understand this impulse. I'm not citing this just in the left, because of course, right-wing accelerationism is arguably the scariest force on earth for thinking for myself. But I understand the accelerationist impulse from a felt, like an emotional level of like, it's all broken. It's too broken to even fix. Like, let's just hurry up and like get to the next thing. But of course, that's not actually like, all the evidence we have is that that's like the worst possible outcome. And you actually, in one of your papers, have a great quote for this. Let me find it.
You know my papers better than I do.
Well, just to speak to this point, you say the global economy isn't a racing car that we can pull over into a pit stop to repair. We must figure out how to transform it radically on the road. And I just loved that, because it captures, I mean, there's an energy there of like, yeah, we got to fix it on the road, but it's also like, oh shit, we got to fix it on the road. Like, we don't get to stop and pull over and sort of have a redo. I don't even know where to lead this as a question, but I just want to send back to you.
Oh, let me say, that is my husband's quote, and I shamelessly borrowed it because I love it too. And as a filmmaker, he's also the lead scriptwriter on many of the projects that we do, and so he comes up with these fantastic metaphors all the time. But the point with that, I think, is that fixing something on the road is potentially very risky, right? You could, try to shift the gearbox of the car and the car veers over the cliff. It can happen, but we no longer have the luxury of time. We've got to figure it out. So, how do we do that in a way that is mindful and that, more importantly, in many respects, builds consensus about how to do it ahead of time? That's not going to be easy. Like I sometimes say, the path ahead is going to be thorny, right? The road is short in terms of how much time we have left. The hill is incredibly steep. The odds are incredibly long that we will be able to succeed, even in a good enough way. And vested interests, the teeth and claws of vested interests are sharp. So all of that gives us very long odds, but we have no choice but to figure it out and do it. And I feel quite confident that even if that doesn't happen at a global level, there are enough like minded, very determined, and creative and intelligent people in the world, like minded, to work on things together, that there will be all kinds of really interesting experiments around the world and how to make things work better. And maybe that's all we can hope for right now.
Mm. One of the key issues that you bring up is population. And this is a famously thorny, divisive issue. What I especially appreciate about your approach, and Bill Rees, who, by the way, says hi, sends a hug. I told him I would
Just love
relay
Bill
one.
to bits, to smithereens.
Yeah, likewise, yeah. Is the feminist issues latent in questions of population? So I'd love to open up to this conversation of how does pronatalism connect to the progress narrative, to the growth narrative, and how do feminist interventions steer us away from some of the critiques that trying to, sensibly address population is eugenicist, fascist, etc.
Absolutely. And this is a prime example of the way a dominant and poisonous narrative has hampered progress for decades. Um, to me, it's always been self-evident that we talk about that the matter of how we talk about population is a matter of justice. It's justice for other kids already on Earth. It's a matter of justice for future generations. It's a matter of environmental justice. And it's a matter of justice for women and girls and their empowerment and their ability to live lives as most men do, with some degree of autonomy and choice. And so I was particularly frustrated by this history. And when I talk about a narrative being poisonous, I don't mean to imply that that history did not exist. It was itself poisonous. There were racist, misogynist, culturally arrogant people for years, and there still are, talking about population as something that other people do and that they need to stop breeding. It's been absolutely horrific. And I just decided that the only way to change that was to wade in and say, stop, people, this is not getting us anywhere. We do live on a finite planet. We are increasing our global population by between 60 and 85 million net new people every year. And the planet is not growing to accommodate that. So, how do we talk about this in a way that allows people to come together on the issue and understand it differently, rather than just bickering and finger pointing and calling people racist if they even dare to talk about it? And so, I know women and girls all around the world who have very strong opinions about it. So I just gave them a platform to step up and talk about it in this, project called Girl Planet that we have, girlplanet.earth. And that helps women have their own voices on the matter and not be talked down to by academics and I must say, some of the most vitriolic academics on this line are academic feminists, whom I personally like, but they just can't get past this idea that if you're talking about population, you must be racist or misogynist or culturally arrogant or whatever. It's a matter for me of just being able to say on a one-on-one basis or in a small group basis, people, we do have a problem. We've got to talk about it. This isn't helping us to put up brick walls and say, this is a taboo topic. It can't be. None of this can be taboo anymore. We've got to find ways to become able to listen to each other again, to unify our conversations in a way that is productive and constructive moving forward, and not get hung up about the past. It was miserable, it was obscene, it was ugly, and we can't allow that to continue, but we still have the problem. So Stable Planet Alliance was an attempt to get organizations and experts and activists from around the world around the same table to say, okay, how do we talk about ecological overshoot, about population, about hyperconsumption in a way that actually makes progress?
Mm. And you also identify how women's health education has a natural population decrease effect without any, militaristic or political intervention. The simple act of trying to create equity for women in education has that effect. Could you share some of that
Absolutely. And you
information?
made me realize that I completely forgot the whole part of your question about pronatalism. But yeah, absolutely without question, giving women opportunities um, enables them to have other lives other than just being childbearing vessels. And uh, in most cases, that's what women actually want, to be able to have choice in their lives, to have rewarding lives. So that's a completely uncontroversial fact. Where the coercion has become in the last few decades is in incentivizing or forcing or culturally intimidating women into having children when they don't want to. And so that pronatalism is often called coercive pronatalism, the kind that you find maybe in Hungary, where Viktor Orban, an autocrat, is pushing women to stay at home and have children. We see that in the USA with J.D. Vance, or Trump in his own inimitable way, uh, trying to talk up the idea that women should really just stay at home and be fertile. And, you know, I don't even want to talk about that. It's so horrific. But the US, we need to be clear about it, has joined the likes of Hungary, Iran, China, Russia, all of its enemies, in becoming increasingly coercive in terms of pronatalism. And we have to ask who benefits from that. Of course, the men who sow their, genes, of course, as Trump would like to do, but also the economies of those countries, the militaries of those countries, the political parties that get more votes, etc. Um, my colleague Nandita Bajaj, who is the chair of the board of Stable Planet Alliance, runs a very good, very mindful, very justice-oriented nonprofit called Population Balance. And she is the world expert on coercive pronatalism and teaches and talks and writes very persuasively on this issue. If you haven't yet interviewed her, I'd highly recommend her for a talk.
Oh, I'd love to. I'd love to. Yeah, because I observe even among people, kind of to your point, like who I deeply respect, who I think are incredible climate communicators, or fill in your subject matter, who have a visceral knee jerk reaction to discussions about population. And again, I understand that historically, any reference to population control, there's basically no good examples. I mean, there's the example that Bill references in one of his papers about an island nation. I forget the name of the island nation, but essentially, within a standard deviation, there's no good examples of population control. And I also understand the argument that this is something that wealthy white nations are maybe gravitating to as a way of distancing themselves from distributing wealth and making change. Those are real, meaningful critiques.
Yeah.
But to your point, it doesn't change the fact that there's an also there. There's a yes and there. And if we're too scared to go to that yes and place, then yeah, I mean, kind of learning from yourself and ecological economists, and really facing the fact that we're using well over 1.5 Earths every year.
Mm.
You just recognize that the less we can manage to use, like every little bit counts, not to be cheesy. So anyway, long story short, I would absolutely love to speak to her.
I think you should, and it's because this is a perfect yes and moment, and it's the thing that drove me to be most frustrated about our tendency as humans to bicker and finger point. People would constantly say, it's not population, it's consumption. Yes, of course it's consumption. And so the global north has the primary responsibility to solve that problem. And all of us need to figure out how to have a human society or human societies around the world where people can live a good enough lifestyle, that they can have a quality of life, and that their future is not made miserable either by having to have 12 children because they don't have alternatives, or because they are spending all their lives in jets or on planes or shopping and feeling increasingly spiritually empty. All of these are evils of our current society, and it's way past time to acknowledge that, call them out, talk about them, and move on. But there was something else I wanted to say about that I have now lost in lost in translation. But one thing that we need to acknowledge is that education and public policies that encourage a smaller family size do sometimes have the unintended consequence of driving hyperconsumption. And a particularly good example of that, I think, is South Korea. South Korea went from a very high natural fertility only a few decades ago to having one of the lowest fertility rates on the planet. But now it is a highly hyper-consumptive capitalist society. So, from the planet's point of view, where is the fine line? From women's and other humans' point of view, and the children of our society's point of view, where is the happy medium? Like my mum used to say, where's the happy medium? Where's that balance between well-being and planetary and human health? And that's why I got into this stuff about more deeply about 20 years ago, because I realized those are the biggest issues that we need to be talking about.
Mm. You referenced climate restorers earlier, and it feels like a good place to bring climate restorers into the conversation. So if you could first share what that is. I don't know if you're allowed to talk about where you are and what you're doing related to that.
Yeah. No, so the Climate Restorers is a project. It's a documentary series, a 4-film journalistic survey of the new field of climate restoration, drawing down carbon dioxide and methane from the atmosphere and trying to stabilize and then decrease excess carbon in the atmosphere so that we can stabilize the climate. But also, as a consequence of that, stabilizing the planet, because of course nature-based solutions and ecosystem restoration are a big part of our ability to do that. And as we've gone through with this project, I've realized increasingly it's about stabilizing the economy, stabilizing the climate and the planet, but also our civilization and economy. Just reining it in, slowing the brakes, and being able to return our life support system to its ability to support human and all other life on Earth. So we are just today filming one of the last sequences on episode 4, which is about vast-scale ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture, soil health, and biochar. So today we're out at the Pacific Rim Institute, which is an educational and prairie restoration institute in Washington State. And I'm giving this podcast from, while I'm squatting in one of their teaching rooms. It will be broadcast, this whole series, from Earth Day 2025 onwards. And our distribution deals are initially with EarthX TV in the USA, following that SBS in Australia, and hopefully RT TV in continental Europe. Then it will be streamed, and we'll probably broadcast in other TV stations. So it's been one of the most exciting projects of my life. It's been a fantastic chance to work well, mostly, with my filmmaker husband. So it's been one of these groovy collaborations. Me, the scientist, he, the filmmaker, us both interested in the bigger questions of how can we make a better society that works better on this planet.
Mm. And were you already working on this when you contributed to the paper that was advocating for change through media and storytelling? Like, I'm curious what the relationship maybe of those two things are.
Yeah, they all did feed into each other. It's a good question. No, we started this actually just in mid 2022. So we've been working on it 2 and a bit years now. And it followed on from a lot of my thinking that came out in those papers. But we were originally asked to do a single film by a man, Peter Fikowski, who had written a book on the subject of climate restoration. And we said, okay, but it's not going to be a long advertisement for your book. We will do an independent journalistic survey of the field. And we started filming it. And as we went on, we realized this is such a big topic. It's like, can you make a film about medicine? Well, okay, where do you start? And so we decided to make 4 films. At that point, the money got, it disappeared in a bad investment by our initial sponsor. But we've kind of plugged through it because I feel that and my husband feels it's one of the most important projects that we could be doing right now to get people aware of the fact that the climate doesn't have to be a one-way downward slope. It's certainly headed there. And again, the odds are long that we can turn that around. But it won't change if we don't take back our agency about it and develop mindsets of restoring the planet and the climate and our society, because all of that is mixed in together. We cannot change the way we operate without a change in mindset and a change in our civilization and how we run our economies. And if we can develop an intention to live differently while we create this new civilization, while we stabilize the planet and the climate, then I think we do have some ability at least to make the results of immediate anthropogenic climate change much less miserable. And that's important, much less miserable. It may not be a happy, sunny, rosy future, but we will get back there if we start now. And it will take some time to get there, but we've got to do it. We don't have a choice.
And it's that dance of like individual responsibility, like taking the case of recycling, has been weaponized by corporations to make individuals feel like the carbon footprint idea. On the other hand, if nobody takes an individual responsibility or small team responsibility to try to restore some of the damage that's being done, however inequitable and unfair, then we really stand no chance. So it's like, yeah, it's this very complicated issue, but that ultimately does still kind of point back to, we really need, it's everything in the kitchen sink.
It's absolutely incredibly important. And fundamentally, for me, it boils down to a question where, starting a conversation with people it can be boiled down to the question of, do we just want to demand rights? Are we willing to step up to our responsibilities? In the USA, we talk a lot about rights. And God knows we haven't had enough rights for enough people in this country for a long time. But we've become so used to talking about rights that it's become an entitlement society. So, are we willing to step up to our responsibilities? They're big subcultures of the United States that are doing that. And this institute, the Pacific Rim Institute, is a good example of it. It's a faith based organization. And I feel that that's probably quite an important part of the picture because a lot of faith communities have a greater connection with the idea of stewardship or earth care, or, they may call it creation care. It doesn't matter to me. It's a matter of personal responsibility and caretaking. And we have that just as strongly in our human psyches and our evolutionary past as we have perhaps a tendency sometimes to overexploit. And that's a matter of culture that can be encouraged with a more mindful culture. And we only have to look at indigenous communities to see how a strong culture of care moving forward and looking backwards is a very strong lesson for us. So the Climate Restorers is largely a story framed by indigenous thinking and how we can retreat from our entitlement mindsets a little bit to find the right balance between collaboration and competition, between rights and responsibilities, between care and harvest or exploitation.
It's beautiful. Any surprises or unexpected revelations along the way?
Oh, plenty. Yeah, far too many to talk about. Your listeners or viewers just need to find us online, theclimaterestorers.com, uh, and see. But yes, we've had all kinds of interesting experiences, including finding innovation and determination and bold speaking and thinking in some of the most surprising places, Philippines, for example. Anyway.
Amazing. Well, speaking of climate restorers, you've been extremely gracious to carve out a little time while you're on set on shooting basically. So I really appreciate the time and want to segue to the 3 questions that I like to ask all my guests. You've inevitably referenced some of the possible answers to these questions. Feel free to call those that back in, but also feel free to take it somewhere totally different. So the first of those is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Yeah, no surprise, I guess, if your listeners have got this far in our conversation, Jesse. But I wish we would all be more conscious. I wish we would be more able to start thinking about our decisions and our responses in terms of how they might reflect our blind spots and our entitlements. Once I started thinking about those in my teen years, the world opened up. I was I was really glad of that. And sometimes it took me to uncomfortable places, but I hope that it made me a slightly better person. So I wish we would think about terms that might initially be confronting, like my colleague Nandita Bajaj first used the phrase human supremacy. And, supremacy is an ugly word, white supremacists. And, and yet, I was listening to that speech again last night that the actor Joaquin Phoenix gave on the subject of human supremacy. He didn't use those words, but he talked about the tragedy of assuming that we can put a cow essentially in prison and take her milk meant for her calf and put it in our coffee and our breakfast cereal and steal her calf away despite her cries that are impossible to, misunderstand. It was a powerful and emotional speech, and I hope people will listen to it. But you know, are terms like human supremacy so confronting that we cannot reflect on them and think about whether we really deserve to imagine ourselves at the top of a pyramid? That's definitely not a place that has credence in indigenous thinking.
Mm.
Yeah, it's the water in which we swim, but we have to bring ourselves out of the water for a minute to get some fresh air and rethink and look at our pond in
Mm.
another way.
Mm. I really appreciate that. The next question is, what is one resource that you would recommend for making better sense of reality, or one that you use?
I can think of three. Do I really have to just give one? Okay.
You can give 3 if you want.
Mm, I've never met him, but the philosopher Roman Krishnarik
Mm.
at Oxford. I love his books, and I would recommend The Good Ancestor as a kind of very light and powerful resource to help people reframe themselves and their lives going forward. On the darker side, I would recommend the essays of the Twitter sphere writer George Sacroclides. He can be very dark. He's very sharp, very powerful, very interesting. So for people that need a reality check, a bucket of ice water in the face, go read George Sacroclides. And then I suppose almost anything of Nate Hagen's or your podcasts. I think you're bringing together, both of you, some of the most interesting and powerful thinkers in the world today that can help us make sense of where we are at this crossroads and how to navigate it. So yeah, I'm super honored to be here with you, Jesse.
Oh, I'm so honored to have you, and so honored you would put me in the same camp as Great Simplification. And Nate Higgins' work is a huge inspiration for me. So I co-sign that recommendation.
Hmm.
Finally, what is one time when your sense of reality was disrupted?
One of my awakenings, I think, was at the age of 12. I think it was my 12th birthday. And in my family, the 12th birthday had a certain importance that maybe 13 didn't. So my parents took me out for a meal. We were living on the coast of Massachusetts in a little town called Situate, which is now known as the poster child of storm surges and floods, but in those days, not so much. And my parents took me out to a restaurant called the Bell Buoy, where I ordered swordfish. And this prompted a discussion between my father and the waitress about heavy metals. I had never heard of heavy metals in apex predator fish before, but it was my eye opening on that line. And the waitress said to my dad that she understood that it was advised now, this would have been 1973, that you didn't eat swordfish more than once a year. And I remember thinking, whoa, it's not poisonous, but it's become poisonous. So what is that and why? And what's wrong with this picture? My father was a quiet man, but he was very well read, and he was a great committed naturalist and environmentalist. And so from that point onwards, talking with him drove me initially into the world of environmental toxicology and what we were doing to this planet. That was one of my first epiphanies.
Wow. That's a wild story.
It's a delicious fish, but what have we done to it? And, as a scientist for years, I've been peer reviewing and editing other people's manuscripts, including a number of manuscripts on topics like PCB levels in the blubber of seals, fur seals, and North sea lions, and things like that. We have just absolutely behaved atrociously on this planet. It's time to stop it.
Boom. On that note, thank you so much again for being on the show. It was even more illuminating than I imagined, and I had high expectations coming in. I'd love if you could share anything you have coming up that folks should be aware of. You referenced Climate Restorers, but you're involved in so many different things. So I wanted to make space for you to let people know what's coming next and where to find you.
Thank you. After we're finished with the Climate Restorers, we're going to be doing a short format news magazine type of thing called the Climate Repair Cafe, which will be talk shows and short clips that are easier to digest than this very rigid sort of 44 or 54 minute TV broadcast format. And I just love doing this kind of work because, ultimately starting the conversation is a big part of finding our solutions, right? Thank you, Jesse.
Indeed. Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing all of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great to talk with you.
Likewise. I'm looking forward to talking again soon. This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.